Entre l'embardé couronné est mouillé l'ancien paquebot de tous les réquisitionnés.
This is part 3 of the Lancastria medal presentation. Next up was Roy Golby, who was collecting on behalf of his uncle Gerald Golby. Mr. Golby is from Perth, and his uncle was with the Royal Army Pay Corps and is buried in Pornic, which is one of the largest cemeteries holding victims of the Lancastria. Roy also attended the memorial service the following Saturday. William Hagger was collecting on behalf of survivor James Hagger, and Mr. Hagger had travelled up from Ipswich with his niece Joanne Leake to collect the medal, and his father served with number 1 Heavy Repair Shop, Royal Army Service Corps. Louise O'Hare was collecting on behalf of victim Thomas Hamper, and she was actually collecting the medal on behalf of Mr. Hamper's son Reg, who was unable to make the presentation on health grounds. Mr. Hamper was a member of 663 Company, Royal Engineers, and his body was unfortunately not recovered. Stanley Hancock was collecting on behalf of survivor Joseph Hancock from Linlithgow, and Mr. Hancock was a private with the 2nd Battalion, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, but had been seconded to the Royal Corps of Signals at the start of the war. Barbara Rutter was collecting on behalf of victim Hubert Rutter, and Mrs. Rutter was travelling to Edinburgh along with her family members from Worcester. Her father served with the 73 Company AMPC at the time of the disaster. His body was unfortunately not recovered. Mrs. Margaret Crawford was collecting on behalf of Dr. John Hill, and Dr. Hill was from Glasgow originally and was the Lancastria surgeon on the day of the disaster. He was last seen in the ship's hospital dealing with some of the wounded when the ship was attacked, and unfortunately his body wasn't recovered either, and his daughter had travelled down from Barriter for the presentation. Mr. Jim Hingle was collecting on behalf of his father, who was a victim of the Lancastria, Oliver Hingle, and Mr. Hingle Senior served with the 15th and 19th the King's Royal Hussars and is buried in Pornic. And this is my father, John Hurst, collecting on behalf of my grandfather, Walter Hurst, who was a survivor from Dundee, member of 663 Artisan Works Company, Royal Engineers, and perhaps the inspiration for my work with the association. Next up is David Hutchison, who was collecting on behalf of Hugh Hutchison. Mr. Hutchison is from Edinburgh, and his father was a quartermaster sergeant, died in 1995, and had served with the Royal Signal Corps. His account is recalled in the John West book, The Loss of Lancastria. Robert Train was collecting on behalf of his uncle, Robert Jameson. Mr. Train is from Edinburgh, from Leith, and he had been a keen artist before the war. Mr. Train is the oldest surviving relative of his uncle who served with the RAF. Jean Johnson was collecting on behalf of her brother, Walter Johnson. Mrs. Johnson is from Stirling in Scotland, central Scotland. Her brother served with the Royal Army Ordnance Corps when he boarded the Lancastria, and according to eyewitnesses, his comrades were directed down to the lower decks in the hours before the attack. Mr. Ken Knaggs was collecting on behalf of survivor Stanley Knaggs, and Mr. Knaggs had travelled up from Gooseberry. Mr. Knaggs has been with the Green Howards and passed away in 1997. Mr. Eugene Maguire had travelled from the north of Ireland for the presentation, had come from County Fermanagh. His uncle served with 663 Artisan Works Company Royal Engineers, and his uncle is buried in Pornick Cemetery. Mr. Eric McGowan was collecting on behalf of Miller McGowan, and Mr. McGowan is from Dalbeattie in Dumfries and Galloway, and he was serving with the Ordnance Corps at the time of the sinking. Margaret Kennedy was collecting on behalf of victim Henry Maguire. Mrs. Kennedy's father was with the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps. For almost 68 years, Mrs. Kennedy and her family from Aberdeen believed his body had not been recovered. All they knew that he was lost at sea, but a week before the presentation, they discovered that his body was buried at St Hilaire de Rhys, thanks to some research work I undertook. Richard Nadine was collecting on behalf of his father, Albert Nadine. Sadly, Mr. Nadine Sr. passed away, aged 95, on the 15th of April 2008, and his son was collecting the medal on his dad's behalf. They'd come up from Dorset for the presentation. David Parton was collecting the medal on behalf of his father, Frederick Parton, who was with the RAF. He was 43 at the time of his death aboard the Lancastria, and is buried at Saint-Palais-sur-Mer. His son lives in Biggar and is treasurer of the Lancastria Association of Scotland. Having a longer discussion with the First Minister there. Councillor Douglas Reid is the son of survivor Duncan Reid, and Councillor Reid is convener of East Ayrshire Council. I only found out, actually, following his father's death last year, that he had survived the Lancastria disaster. His dad served with the Royal Scots Fusiliers. Sarah Sutherland was collecting the medal on behalf of Joseph Ritchie. Mrs. Sutherland's father was from Edinburgh, would have been celebrating his 101st birthday had he been alive for the presentation. Mr. Ritchie was an army chaplain and based in Nantes. At the time of the Lancastria disaster, he passed away in 1996 and is survived by his wife, Frances Ritchie. And Fiona Simon, of course, is our chair of the association, and was collecting on behalf of her father, Andrew Richardson, who was a victim of the Lancastria. Mr. Richardson grew up in Kirkcaldy. He was active in the town's Baptist church before the outbreak of war. Mr. Richardson served with the Royal Army Service Corps. Sandra Freeman was collecting on behalf of her father, Gilbert Skelton, who was a survivor of the disaster. Mrs. Freeman had travelled up from London for the presentation. Mr. Skelton, who served with the Sherwood Foresters, passed away in 1995 and had been an active member of the first Lancastria Association, which was called the Lancastria Survivors Association, and was their secretary for many years. George Smith was collecting on behalf of Norman Smith from Glasgow. Mr. Smith is specifically from Bells Hill. He understands that his father had been recommended for a VC for his repeated attempts to save drowning men around him, but this was blocked by senior officers. He returned to Plymouth on the 20th of June, but unfortunately passed away 3 days after succumbing to his wounds. William Tawes was collecting on behalf of his brother Stanley Tawes. Mr. Tawes was one of the RAF contingent aboard the Lancastria, who were placed in the ship's holds with his comrades and other men from 98 Squadron RAF. They sustained a direct hit during the attack. And finally, Mrs. Elizabeth McLaughlin was collecting on behalf of survivor Alan Wood. Mrs. McLaughlin is the daughter of Mr. Wood and is from Moodiesburn in Glasgow. Mr. Wood served with the Royal Army Service Corps and swam for about 2.5 hours before being rescued by a small French fishing boat. He passed away in 1989. And that really ended the presentation. Thereafter, we went through to another part of the Parliament complex to watch the UK premiere rather of Christophe Francois' outstanding documentary.
Est mouillé l'ancien paquebot de tous les réquisitionnés, c'est le plus grand et le plus beau.